Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of history's most pivotal and haunting moments. The days when two Japanese cities became the first and only targets of nuclear weapons in warfare. You'll walk through the streets of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, 1945, experiencing what ordinary people saw, felt, and endured when the atomic age began with two flashes of light that changed everything. Fair warning, you probably won't survive this psychologically unscathed, because we're talking about the kind of human suffering that rewrites your understanding of what our species is capable of. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing our global bedtime community. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945, and the morning feels deceptively ordinary. The summer air already carries that familiar humid weight that makes your cotton yukata cling to your skin. You slide open the shoji screens, and golden sunlight filters through, casting geometric patterns across the tatami mats. Outside, the Oda River flows peacefully through the city, its 7 channels creating the delta that gives Hiroshima its unique character. You can hear the clip-clop of wooden geta sandals on stone as your neighbors begin their daily routines. The city bustles with about 350,000 people, though that number has been fluctuating throughout the war. Many children were evacuated to the countryside, while others have returned as the immediate threat seemed to lessen. You notice how the war has changed everything. The metal has been stripped from fences and railings for the war effort, leaving behind wooden replacements that creak in the morning breeze. Rice is scarce, so your breakfast consists of sweet potato and barley, foods that would have been animal feed before the conflict. Historians still argue whether President Truman knew the full extent of what the Manhattan Project had created. But what's undeniable is that, at this moment, you're completely unaware that 12 miles above, the Enola Gay is approaching with a payload that will redefine human capability for destruction. The irony isn't lost on anyone familiar with the story. Hiroshima was chosen partly because it had been relatively untouched by conventional bombing, making it a perfect laboratory for measuring atomic destruction. Talk about being the wrong place at the wrong time. You step outside, and the morning air carries the scent of charcoal from breakfast fires, mixed with the faint industrial smell from the harbor. Hiroshima is a significant military hub, housing the headquarters of the 2nd General Army and serving as a major supply depot. The city's strategic importance made it a target, but walking through the residential districts, you see mostly civilians going about their lives, mothers hanging laundry, children playing with simple wooden toys, elderly men tending small gardens squeezed between buildings. The architecture around you represents centuries of Japanese craftsmanship, with traditional wooden structures standing alongside more modern concrete buildings. Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, a European-style building with a distinctive copper dome, stands out against the skyline. Little do you know, this building will become one of the most haunting symbols of nuclear destruction, its skeletal remains preserved forever as the atomic bomb dome. As you walk toward the city center, you pass groups of students who have been mobilized for war work. These middle school kids, some as young as 12, are heading to factories or demolition sites where they're clearing fire breaks, wide strips of empty land designed to prevent the spread of fires from conventional bombing. The cruel irony is that this morning, many of these children are working outdoors, completely exposed to what's coming. You notice how the war has stripped the city of its young men. Most faces you see belong to women, children, and elderly people. The women wear simple work clothes, their hair tied back practically, many carrying babies on their backs in traditional carriers. There's a quiet determination in their movements, the kind of resilience that comes from years of rationing, air raid drills, and uncertainty. The morning sun climbs higher, and you can feel the heat building. By 8 a.m., the temperature is already approaching 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity makes it feel even warmer. You're wearing light cotton clothing, which will prove to be both a blessing and a curse in the coming moments. Cotton burns more slowly than synthetic materials, potentially saving your life, but it also means you'll feel every degree of the heat that's about to engulf the city. As you move through the streets, you pass the familiar landmarks that define your world: the Shima Hospital, the AA Bridge with its distinctive T-shape, the bustling Nakamura district where vendors sell vegetables and fish despite wartime shortages. Each of these locations has been meticulously mapped by American intelligence, though you don't know that the T-shaped bridge has been chosen as the aiming point for something called Little Boy, a name that sounds almost innocent, but represents the culmination of humanity's deadliest scientific achievement. The morning continues with an almost supernatural normalcy, as if the universe itself is holding its breath before everything changes forever. You pause in your morning routine as the familiar wail of air raid sirens echoes across Hiroshima. It's 7:09 a.m., and you've heard this sound countless times during the war, the rising and falling tone that sends everyone scurrying for shelter. But today feels different somehow. You notice that the siren stops after just a few minutes, followed by the all-clear signal. False alarm, apparently. The radio crackles with the announcement that it was just a small formation of American planes, probably reconnaissance aircraft. Nothing to worry about. What you don't know is that one of those planes was the Enola Gay, a B-29 superfortress carrying Colonel Paul Tibbets and his crew, along with a uranium bomb that took 3 years and $2 billion to develop. The plane had taken off from Tinian Island at 2:45 a.m., flying through the night toward your city. Tibbets named the aircraft after his mother, Enola Gay Tibbets, though historians still argue whether she ever knew the significance of that honor. Imagine explaining to your mom that you named a weapon of mass destruction after her. That's It's one Mother's Day card that writes itself. You return to your morning activities, perhaps hanging laundry or preparing for work, when you notice something unusual in the clear blue sky. It's about 8:14 a.m., and you spot a single aircraft flying at an unusually high altitude. The plane appears as just a silver glint against the azure backdrop, moving steadily across the sky. There's something almost peaceful about it, like watching a bird soar effortlessly through the morning air. You might even pause to admire how the sunlight catches its wings. This is the moment when the Enola Gay releases its payload. At exactly 8:15 a.m. and 17 seconds, the bomb bay doors open, and Little Boy begins its 43-second fall toward your city. The bomb is about 10 feet long and weighs nearly 10,000 pounds, but from your perspective on the ground, you can't see anything. The aircraft is flying at 31,000 feet, well above the range of Japanese anti-aircraft guns, and the bomb itself is too small to be visible from such a distance. What you can see is the plane making a sudden, sharp turn to the right, a maneuver so abrupt and violent that it seems like the aircraft is trying to escape from something. This is exactly what's happening. Tibbets has just 43 seconds to get as far away as possible before the explosion. The B-29 performs what's called a breakaway maneuver, diving and turning simultaneously to maximize distance from the blast zone. The crew members are wearing special dark glasses to protect their eyes from the flash they know is coming. You continue watching the sky, perhaps wondering why that plane turned so dramatically. Other people around you have noticed it too. There's something compelling about aircraft behavior that seems unusual. A few people point and comment to their neighbors. Children who were playing stop to look up. Workers pause in their tasks. For these precious few seconds, you're all unknowingly sharing the last moments of Hiroshima as you've always known it. Morning air is still and humid, perfect conditions for what's about to happen. Weather reports from earlier reconnaissance flights confirmed that visibility was excellent over Hiroshima, with minimal cloud cover. The weather officer on the Enola Gay, Lieutenant George Marquardt, had given the green light for the mission. If the weather had been cloudy, the target might have been changed to Nagasaki or Kokura, the backup cities. Your fate, in a sense, depends on the morning's clear skies. At this moment, the bomb is falling through the atmosphere, its internal mechanisms preparing for detonation. The fusing system is designed to trigger the explosion at exactly 1,968 feet above the ground, a height calculated to maximize damage across the widest possible area. The target point is the A bridge, chosen because its distinctive T-shape makes it easily identifiable from the air, even at high altitude. You're probably going about your business now, the plane forgotten as it disappears from view. Maybe you're feeding chickens in your small backyard, or walking to work, or preparing breakfast for your family. The everyday details of life continue with stubborn normalcy. The sound of wooden sandals on stone, the smell of incense from a neighborhood shrine, the chatter of voices speaking in the soft cadences of the Hiroshima dialect. Children are playing in the streets, their laughter mixing with the sounds of adults beginning their workday. Students in their dark uniforms are gathering at demolition sites, ready to clear more fire breaks. Mothers are preparing lunch boxes for their families, carefully rationing the limited ingredients available. Elderly people are sweeping their storefronts, maintaining the cleanliness and order that characterizes Japanese daily life, even during wartime. The irony is overwhelming. At this precise moment, you're living through the last minute of the pre-atomic world, and everything seems perfectly normal. The sun is shining, birds are singing, and life continues with the same rhythm it's followed for generations. In less than 60 seconds, that rhythm will be shattered forever, and you'll find yourself in a world that no one has ever experienced before. You're in the middle of whatever morning task occupies your attention when the world suddenly turns white. Not the gentle white of fresh snow or paper, but an impossible, searing white that seems to come from everywhere at once. It's 8:15 a.m. and 17 seconds, and you've just experienced the first nuclear weapon ever used in warfare. The flash is so bright that it burns shadows into concrete and vaporizes people standing closest to the hypocenter. You don't have time to think, barely time to react, as your entire reality transforms in a fraction of a second. The light is unlike anything in human experience, brighter than the sun, intense enough to cause temporary blindness, even if you're not looking directly at it. Your eyes slam shut involuntarily, but the brilliance penetrates your eyelids, creating a red-orange glow that floods your vision. If you're outdoors, which many people are at this time of morning, the light hits you like a physical force. Your skin feels the heat instantly, as if you've opened an oven door and stuck your face directly into the blast of hot air. Except this heat comes from all directions simultaneously. The atomic bomb, little boy, has just detonated 1,968 feet above the Shima Hospital, almost directly over your city. The explosion releases energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT in a fraction of a second. At the moment of detonation, the fireball reaches temperatures of millions of degrees, hotter than the core of the sun. The air itself becomes plasma, a state of matter that doesn't exist naturally on Earth's surface. Historians still argue whether the pilots of the Enola Gay truly understood the magnitude of what they were unleashing. But the physics are undeniable. You're experiencing the power that fuels stars. The flash lasts only about 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds contain multiple waves of destruction. First comes the thermal radiation, the intense heat that you feel on your skin. This travels at the speed of light, so it reaches you instantly. People within a half-mile radius of the hypocenter are killed immediately by the heat, their bodies literally vaporized or burned beyond recognition. Further out, the thermal radiation causes severe burns and sets fires throughout the city. Your cotton clothing, if you're wearing it, might smolder or catch fire, but synthetic materials would have melted to your skin. Within those same 3 seconds, the light has permanently burned shadows into the landscape. Where people stood between the blast and concrete surfaces, their bodies blocked the thermal radiation, creating what look like ghostly silhouettes on walls and steps. These human shadows will become some of the most haunting evidence of the atomic bombing. A person sitting on stone steps left their shadow burned into the stone. Someone walking across a bridge left their outline on the pavement. These shadows represent the last moments of lives that ended instantly, a permanent record of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. If you're lucky enough to be indoors or behind some form of protection, you might survive the initial flash, but you're not safe yet. The light has set fires throughout the city, and the heat wave has caused severe burns to anyone exposed. You might notice that your skin feels like it's burning, even if you can't see any flames. The thermal radiation has penetrated clothing and flesh, causing damage that won't be fully apparent for hours or days. The flash has also created electromagnetic effects that you might not immediately understand. Radios go dead, electrical systems fail, and compasses spin wildly. The atomic explosion has generated an electromagnetic pulse that disrupts electronic equipment throughout the city. This adds to the confusion and terror as normal methods of communication and navigation suddenly stop working. You're cut off from the outside world at the exact moment when you need help most desperately. Your eyes are still recovering from the flash when the next wave hits. The light was just the beginning. Now comes the blast wave, a wall of compressed air moving at supersonic speed. You have perhaps 15 seconds between the flash and the arrival of the shock wave, depending on how far you are from the hypocenter. This is just enough time to register what's happening before the real destruction begins. The eerie silence that follows the flash is almost as disturbing as the light itself. For a few seconds, the world seems frozen in time. Birds stop singing, insects go silent, and even the wind seems to pause. This supernatural quiet is broken only by the sound of glass beginning to crack, and the first confused voices of people trying to understand what's happening. Someone near you might whisper a prayer or call out a name, their voice sounding strange and hollow in the weird atmospheric conditions created by the explosion. You might notice that the air itself looks different, shimmering and distorted, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The explosion has created massive temperature differentials that bend light and create optical illusions. The sky takes on an odd color, neither blue nor gray, but something in between, as if the atmosphere itself has been damaged. This is the moment when you realize that whatever just happened, it's not like the conventional bombing raids you've experienced before. This is something new, something that human beings have never encountered. The scale of destruction is already apparent, even in these first few seconds. Buildings that were solid and permanent a moment ago are now damaged or destroyed. The landscape itself seems to have changed, as if the earth has been wounded. The blast wave hits you with the force of a supernatural hurricane. If you're standing, it knocks you down. If you're sitting, it throws you across the room. If you're walking, it picks you up and hurls you like a leaf in a tornado. This is the moment when Hiroshima begins to physically disintegrate around you. The shock wave travels at about 1,000 feet per second, carrying with it the power to flatten buildings, uproot trees, and turn everyday objects into deadly projectiles. You're experiencing something that no human being in history had ever survived until this moment. The sound that accompanies the blast wave is indescribable. Imagine the loudest thunder you've ever heard, multiplied by 1,000, mixed with the sound of every building in the city collapsing simultaneously. It's not just noise. It's a physical force that you feel in your bones, your teeth, your internal organs. The sound waves are so intense that they can burst eardrums and cause internal bleeding. Many survivors report that the sound seemed to come from inside their own bodies, as if their skeletons were vibrating like tuning forks. At ground zero, directly beneath the explosion, the destruction is total and immediate. The Shima Hospital, which served as the target point, simply ceases to exist. The building and everyone inside it are vaporized in the first microsecond of the blast. The ground temperature reaches thousands of degrees, hot enough to melt steel and stone. Granite surfaces bubble and flow like lava. Bronze Buddha statues in nearby temples melt and run like water. The very sand in the courtyard fuses into glass, creating a new mineral that geologists will later name trinitite. If you're within a half-mile radius of the hypocenter, the destruction around you is complete and horrifying. Multi-story buildings collapse into piles of rubble in seconds. The famous Hiroshima castle, which had stood for centuries, is reduced to scattered stones. The wooden structures that make up most of the city's residential areas simply vanish, blown away like paper in a windstorm. Historians still argue whether the decision to target a city center rather than a military installation was justified. But the immediate reality is that you're watching an entire urban landscape disappear. The blast wave creates a phenomenon called negative pressure that makes the destruction even more devastating. After the initial shock wave passes, the air rushes back toward the hypocenter, creating a reverse wind that can be almost as destructive as the original blast. This is why witnesses report seeing debris flying in multiple directions, first away from the explosion, then back toward it, as if the bomb is inhaling the city it just destroyed. You watch in horror as familiar landmarks vanish in seconds. The A Bridge, that distinctive T-shaped structure that served as the aiming point, survives partially because it's built of reinforced concrete, but it's severely damaged and twisted. The Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, that European-style building with the copper dome, has its dome blown off and its walls stripped away, leaving only the steel framework that will become the famous atomic bomb dome. The people around you are experiencing trauma beyond anything in human experience. Those who survive the initial blast wave are often naked, their clothes blown or burned away. Many are covered in what looks like black rain, actually radioactive fallout mixed with ash and debris. Some people are walking around in a daze, seemingly unhurt but in deep shock. Others are screaming, calling for family members, or simply staring in blank incomprehension at the transformed landscape. The fires start almost immediately. The thermal radiation from the explosion has ignited everything flammable within a 2-mile radius. Wooden buildings, paper screens, tatami mats, clothing, and vegetation all burst into flames simultaneously. What you're witnessing is the birth of a firestorm, a phenomenon where individual fires merge into a single, massive conflagration that creates its own weather system. The flames generate winds that feed more oxygen to the fire, creating a self-sustaining cycle of destruction. The temperature in the fire zone reaches over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The air itself becomes toxic, filled with carbon monoxide and other deadly gases. Even if you survive the initial blast and avoid the flames, you're breathing poison with every breath. The smoke is so thick that noon looks like twilight, and the sun appears as a dim red disk through the haze. You might notice people emerging from the rubble with injuries, unlike anything you've seen in conventional bombing raids. These aren't just cuts and broken bones. These are burns that seem to come from inside the body, blistering and peeling skin that looks like it's been cooked. Some people appear to be unhurt, but are vomiting blood or collapsing from invisible injuries. This is your first encounter with radiation sickness, though the term doesn't exist yet in common vocabulary. The infrastructure of the city has been obliterated. Water mains are broken, so there's no way to fight the fires. Electric lines are down, cutting off communication and power. Roads are blocked by debris, making rescue efforts nearly impossible. The hospitals that might treat the injured are themselves destroyed or badly damaged. You're witnessing the collapse of civilization in real time, compressed into a few minutes of unimaginable destruction. As you struggle to comprehend what's happening, you realize that this isn't just a bigger bomb. It's something fundamentally different. The destruction is too complete, too uniform, too far-reaching to be explained by conventional explosives. You're looking at the birth of a new age, though you don't know it yet. The atomic age has begun, and your city is its first victim. In the hours following the blast, you begin to notice something strange and terrifying happening to the people around you. Individuals who seem to have escaped the initial destruction relatively unharmed are suddenly becoming violently ill. They're vomiting, their hair is falling out in clumps, and they're developing burns that seem to come from nowhere. You're witnessing the first cases of acute radiation syndrome in human history, though no one has a name for it yet. The invisible killer that accompanied the flash is beginning to reveal itself. The radiation released by the atomic bomb has turned your city into a massive, open-air laboratory for studying the effects of ionizing radiation on human beings. The people around you are experiencing different levels of exposure depending on where they were when the bomb exploded, what they were doing, and how much debris they encountered afterward. Some received lethal doses that will kill them within days, while others received amounts that will cause illness, cancer, and genetic damage that won't manifest for years or decades. You might notice that some survivors seem to be glowing or emanating a strange odor, though this is likely a combination of shock stress, and the various chemicals released by the explosion. However, the radiation itself is very real and very dangerous. The bomb has scattered radioactive isotopes throughout the city, contaminating everything they touch. The water you drink, the food you eat, the air you breathe, all of it is now carrying invisible particles that damage your cells at the molecular level. The medical response to these mysterious symptoms is heartbreaking to witness. Doctors and nurses, many of whom are injured themselves, are encountering conditions they've never seen before. They try traditional treatments, bandages for burns, surgery for wounds, medicine for nausea, but nothing works against radiation sickness. The patients keep getting worse despite their efforts. Some physicians begin to suspect that the American bomb released some kind of poison gas, while others wonder if it's a new type of biological weapon. Historians still argue whether President Truman and his advisors fully understood the radiation effects when they made the decision to use the bomb. But the evidence suggests that even the scientists who created it weren't entirely certain about the long-term consequences. The Manhattan Project included some research into radiation effects, but nothing on this scale had ever been attempted. You and your fellow survivors are unwitting participants in humanity's first nuclear experiment. The symptoms you're seeing follow a predictable pattern that will later be categorized into stages. First comes the initial radiation syndrome, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea within hours of exposure. This is followed by a latent period where people seem to recover, giving false hope to families and medical workers. Then comes the acute phase, where the real damage becomes apparent. Massive infections, internal bleeding, and organ failure as the radiation destroys the body's ability to replace damaged cells. What makes this particularly cruel is that the people who stayed to help others often received higher doses of radiation than those who fled immediately. The rescue workers, medical personnel, and family members who searched for survivors in the most damaged areas exposed themselves to concentrated radioactive fallout. Their compassion and dedication are literally killing them, though they don't understand why they're becoming sicker than some of the people they're trying to help. You might witness scenes that will haunt you for the rest of your life if you survive. Children asking why their parents won't wake up. Parents watching their children waste away from an invisible sickness. Elderly people who survived the initial blast only to die slowly from radiation exposure. The psychological trauma of watching people deteriorate from an unknown cause adds another layer of horror to an already unimaginable situation. Radiation has also contaminated the environment in ways that won't be fully understood for decades. The black rain that fell after the explosion carried radioactive particles throughout the region, contaminating crops, water sources, and soil. People who drank from wells or ate food grown in the area received additional doses of radiation. Even the ash from cremated bodies contains radioactive isotopes, creating a cycle of contamination that affects the living and the dead alike. Some survivors develop what appears to be a new disease. Their white blood cell counts drop to dangerous levels, making them vulnerable to infections that would normally be minor. Others suffer from a condition that will later be called radiation dermatitis, where their skin becomes raw and inflamed weeks after the initial exposure. The variety of symptoms makes it difficult for medical professionals to understand that they're all caused by the same invisible force. The social consequences of radiation exposure are almost as devastating as the physical ones. Families are torn apart not just by death, but by the fear of contamination. Some people avoid contact with survivors, afraid that whatever mysterious illness is spreading might be contagious. Others refuse to marry into families that were exposed, fearing that their children might be affected. The stigma associated with radiation exposure will follow the hibakusha, the bomb survivors, for generations. You're living through the moment when humanity first encountered the double-edged nature of nuclear technology. The same scientific principles that will eventually power cities and propel spacecraft into space have just been used to create a weapon that kills in multiple ways through heat, blast, and invisible radiation that continues to claim lives long after the explosion itself is over. The atomic age has begun, and its first lesson is that some technologies are too powerful to control once they're unleashed. You survive the first day, then the second, though survival feels like too optimistic a word for what you're experiencing. The city smolders around you, and the smell of smoke mixed with something else, something organic and terrible, fills the air constantly. It's now August 8th, and rumors are spreading through the refugee camps and makeshift shelters that have sprung up around Hiroshima. People whisper about a single American bomb that destroyed the entire city, but that seems impossible. How can one bomb do what required hundreds of aircraft during previous raids? The Japanese government is struggling to understand what happened. Military officials who visit the ruins report back to Tokyo with descriptions that sound like science fiction. They speak of complete destruction extending for miles, of shadows burned into stone, of a mysterious sickness affecting survivors. Emperor Hirohito himself is briefed on the situation, though historians still argue whether he fully grasped the implications of what the Americans had developed. The term atomic bomb means nothing to most people. It's just a collection of syllables that fails to capture the reality of what you've experienced. You're living in a world where information travels slowly and uncertainty breeds fear. Radio broadcasts from Tokyo speak vaguely of a new type of bomb, but provide no real explanation. Some people believe the Americans have developed a death ray. Others think it was a massive conventional explosion, and still others whisper about secret Japanese weapons that somehow backfired. The lack of reliable information makes the trauma worse. You can't even properly name what happened to you. The rescue efforts are overwhelmed and chaotic. Military units from other parts of Japan arrive to help, but they're not equipped for this type of disaster. The soldiers have experience with conventional bombing damage, but Hiroshima presents challenges they've never encountered. The radiation, though they don't understand it, makes some areas too dangerous to enter. Equipment fails mysteriously, and some rescue workers become ill after spending time in the most heavily damaged areas. Foreign journalists are beginning to arrive, the Japanese government is trying to limit their access. The few reports that reach the outside world describe devastation beyond anything previously seen in warfare. However, the full extent of the radiation effects won't be understood for weeks or months. So even these early accounts miss the complete picture of what atomic weapons can do. You might find yourself in one of the refugee centers set up in schools or temples outside the city. These facilities are overcrowded and undersupplied, but they represent safety from the ongoing fires and collapse of buildings in Hiroshima proper. The people around you are dealing with trauma in different ways. Some sit in complete silence. Others talk compulsively about what they saw. And many simply stare into space with the 1,000-yard stare that will later be recognized as a symptom of severe psychological trauma. The medical situation is becoming increasingly desperate. The doctors and nurses who survived the initial blast are trying to treat injuries they don't understand with supplies that are rapidly running out. Traditional Japanese medicine has no treatments for radiation sickness, and Western medicine isn't much better. The mysterious illness is spreading through the refugee population, and some people are beginning to believe that the Americans have poisoned the air or water. Food and water are scarce, and what's available might be contaminated with radioactive fallout. You're forced to make impossible choices, drink water that might be poisoned or die of thirst, eat food that might be contaminated, or starve. The normal systems that provide for human needs have completely collapsed, leaving you dependent on whatever emergency supplies can be brought in from outside the affected area. The psychological impact of living through these 3 days is almost unbearable. You're dealing with the grief of losing family members, friends, and your entire way of life, while also trying to understand what happened and whether it might happen again. The uncertainty is perhaps the worst part. You don't know if you're safe, if the sickness will affect you, or if the Americans have more of these weapons ready to use on other Japanese cities. Communication with the outside world is nearly impossible. The telephone and telegraph systems in Hiroshima were destroyed, and the few radio sets that work are receiving confusing and contradictory reports. You might hear Tokyo Rose broadcasting propaganda that downplays the damage, or you might catch fragments of American radio broadcasts that describe the bombing in technical terms that mean nothing to you. The isolation adds to the sense of existing in a nightmare from which you can't wake up. Children are particularly affected by the uncertainty and fear. Many have lost parents or been separated from family members in the chaos following the explosion. They don't understand why their city was destroyed or why the adults around them seem so frightened and confused. Their questions: when can we go home? Why are people getting sick? Will the Americans come back? Are impossible to answer because no one knows. As August 8th turns into August 9th, you might notice increased military activity in the sky. American reconnaissance aircraft are flying over Japan, and there are rumors of large formations of B-29s being spotted over different parts of the country. The fear is palpable. Everyone knows that if the Americans have one of these terrible weapons, they probably have more. question isn't whether they'll use another one, but where and when. You're living through the last hours of the world as it existed before nuclear weapons proved their devastating power twice over. Tomorrow, another Japanese city will experience what Hiroshima has endured, and the nuclear age will be irrevocably established. But for now, you're suspended in a state of dread, waiting for something that you can't even properly imagine. You're in Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, and the morning brings news that makes your blood run cold. Radio reports from Tokyo speak of Hiroshima's destruction, though the details are vague and hard to believe. A single American bomb allegedly destroyed an entire city. It sounds like propaganda, but the fear in the announcer's voice suggests otherwise. You go about your morning routine in this port city built on hills, unaware that you're about to witness the second atomic bombing in human history. Nagasaki is different from Hiroshima in important ways. The city is more industrialized, with major weapons manufacturing facilities, including the Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works. The topography is also dramatically different. Where Hiroshima sits on a flat delta, Nagasaki spreads across steep hillsides and narrow valleys. This geography will actually limit the damage from the atomic bomb, as the hills contain the blast and prevent the total destruction that flattened Hiroshima. Still, what you're about to experience will be more than enough to demonstrate that the Americans have multiple atomic weapons and are willing to use them. The original target for today's mission was Kokura, a city about 100 miles northeast of Nagasaki. The B-29 called Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, spent nearly an hour circling Kokura, but thick clouds and industrial smoke made visual targeting impossible. The crew's orders were explicit. They could only drop the bomb if they could see the target visually, not through radar. After burning precious fuel over Kokura, Sweeney made the decision to head for the secondary target, your city. You might notice the air raid sirens around 7:50 a.m., followed by the all-clear signal when the danger seems to pass. But unlike Hiroshima, Nagasaki gets a second warning around 10:53 a.m. when air raid sirens sound again. This time, many people take shelter, which will save thousands of lives. However, the all-clear sounds at 11:00 a.m., and people begin emerging from their hiding places just as Boxcar approaches the city. At 11:02 a.m., you experience the second atomic flash in human history. The bomb called Fat Man detonates 1,650 feet above the Urakami Valley, about 2 miles northwest of the city center. The explosion is even more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb, equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT compared to Hiroshima's 15,000 tons. The flash of light is just as brilliant, just as impossible to comprehend, turning the world white for those crucial seconds that separate the before and after of your existence. The terrain saves you from experiencing the complete devastation that flattened Hiroshima. The hills that surround Nagasaki's valleys act like natural barriers, containing the blast and preventing the shock wave from spreading uniformly across the entire city. If you're in the Urakami Valley, directly below the explosion, you face destruction as complete as anything seen in Hiroshima. But if you're in other parts of the city, the hills provide some protection, creating a patchwork of total destruction and relative survival. The Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works, one of the primary targets, is obliterated. The massive industrial complex simply ceases to exist, its machinery and buildings reduced to twisted metal and rubble. The Urakami Cathedral, the largest Christian church in Asia, is destroyed completely, a bitter irony since Nagasaki has the largest Christian population in Japan. The cathedral's twin towers, which took decades to build, collapse in seconds, and the church's famous bells are found hundreds of yards away, melted and twisted by the heat. What makes Nagasaki particularly tragic is that it wasn't even the primary target. The city is being destroyed because of weather conditions over Kokura, because of clouds and smoke that prevented the bombardier from seeing his intended target. Your suffering is the result of meteorological chance, a random atmospheric condition that changed the course of history. Historians still argue whether the bombing of Nagasaki was necessary after Hiroshima had already demonstrated America's atomic capability. But the immediate reality is that you're living through the second nuclear attack in 3 days. The death toll in Nagasaki will eventually reach about 70,000 people, fewer than Hiroshima's 140,000. But the individual stories are just as heartbreaking. Families are separated by the blast, children are orphaned, and entire neighborhoods vanish in the thermal radiation and shock wave. The Nagasaki Medical College, ironically one of the few institutions that might have helped treat radiation victims, is destroyed along with most of its staff and students. You witness the same pattern of destruction and mysterious illness that befell Hiroshima, but now there's a terrible familiarity to it. The Japanese government knows what to expect: the flash, the fires, the radiation sickness that will claim lives for weeks and months to come. This knowledge makes the second bombing somehow more horrifying than the first. Hiroshima was a terrible surprise. Nagasaki is a deliberate demonstration that America has multiple atomic weapons and is willing to use them systematically. The international implications are staggering, though you can't know it yet. The world is watching as the United States proves that atomic weapons are not just experimental curiosities, but deployable military tools. The Soviet Union, which had been preparing to invade Japan, now sees that America possesses weapons that could potentially be used against them. The nuclear arms race hasn't begun yet, but its inevitability is being written in the ruins of your city. Foreign correspondents who reach Nagasaki find a population that's not just traumatized, but psychologically broken by the realization that this new type of warfare can be repeated at will. The survivors you encounter aren't just dealing with their own injuries and losses there, grappling with the knowledge that their entire civilization has become vulnerable to instant annihilation. The atomic age hasn't just begun, It's been confirmed as a permanent feature of human existence. The rescue efforts in Nagasaki benefit from the lessons learned in Hiroshima, but they're still woefully inadequate for dealing with atomic destruction. Military units arrive more quickly. Medical supplies are rushed in from unaffected areas, and there's a better understanding of the need to evacuate people from the most heavily damaged zones. However, the fundamental problem remains. Nobody really knows how to treat radiation sickness or decontaminate areas affected by atomic fallout. You're discovering that Fat Man creates a different kind of hell than Little Boy did in Hiroshima. The Nagasaki bomb uses plutonium instead of uranium, and while the basic destruction looks similar, the flash, the heat, the blast wave, the details of devastation reveal subtle but important differences. The plutonium bomb is more efficient at converting nuclear material into explosive energy, which means more destruction per pound of fissile material. You're experiencing the result of 3 years of scientific refinement in weapons design, and the improvements are terrifyingly effective. The fireball from Fat Man reaches higher temperatures and burns longer than the Hiroshima bomb. The thermal radiation extends further, causing severe burns at greater distances from the hypocenter. If you're within a mile of the explosion, you face burns that penetrate deeper into tissue and heal more slowly than conventional fire injuries. The plutonium bomb also produces different radioactive isotopes, creating a unique signature of contamination that will help scientists track the bomb's effects for decades to come. What you notice most immediately is the color of the destruction. While Hiroshima's ruins were dominated by the gray of concrete dust and the black of charcoal, Nagasaki's devastation has an almost reddish tint from the iron-rich soil and the different materials that made up the city's industrial infrastructure. The Mitsubishi factories contained huge amounts of steel and other metals, which melted and resolidified into strange sculptures of twisted industrial art. The landscape looks like the aftermath of a volcanic eruption, mixed with the remnants of a steel foundry. The blast pattern is also different due to the terrain. In Hiroshima, the shock wave spread relatively uniformly across the flat delta, but in Nagasaki, the hills create shadow zones where the damage is less severe alongside areas of concentrated destruction, where the blast wave bounced off valley walls and intensified. You might find yourself in a neighborhood that's completely untouched, while the next valley over has been utterly destroyed. This geographic lottery of survival creates a surreal patchwork of devastation. Historians still argue whether the decision to use a plutonium bomb on Nagasaki was motivated by scientific curiosity or military necessity, but the immediate effect is that you're living through humanity's first comparative test of nuclear weapons. The Manhattan Project scientists are gathering data on 2 different bomb designs, and your city is serving as an unwitting laboratory for studying the relative effectiveness of uranium versus plutonium weapons. The radiation signature from the plutonium bomb will prove to be more complex and longer lasting than the uranium bomb. Plutonium has a half-life of over 24,000 years, meaning that traces of the Nagasaki bomb will remain detectable in the environment for millennia. You're being exposed to radioactive isotopes that will contaminate the area for generations, creating a legacy of atomic destruction that extends far beyond the immediate casualties. Medical effects you witness also show subtle differences from Hiroshima. The plutonium bomb produces more neutron radiation, which damages DNA in different ways than the gamma radiation that dominated in Hiroshima. The result is a slightly different pattern of radiation sickness, with some victims showing symptoms that doctors haven't seen before. The learning curve for treating atomic bomb victims is starting over again, with new variables to consider and new complications to understand. You're also experiencing the psychological impact of the second bombing differently than Hiroshima survivors experienced the first. While Hiroshima was a complete shock, Nagasaki carries the weight of inevitability. People know what's happening as soon as they see the flash, and the terror is mixed with a terrible familiarity. Children who survived Hiroshima and were evacuated to Nagasaki are experiencing atomic bombing for the second time in 3 days, a trauma that defies comprehension. The international reaction to the second bombing is also different. While Hiroshima shocked the world with the revelation that atomic weapons existed, Nagasaki confirms that America has multiple bombs and is willing to use them repeatedly. The message to Japan and the world is clear. Surrender now or face the systematic nuclear destruction of Japanese cities. The diplomatic pressure created by the threat of continued atomic bombing is as important as the physical destruction in bringing the war to an end. The industrial nature of Nagasaki means that the economic impact of the bombing extends beyond the immediate destruction. The city was a major center for weapons production, and its destruction eliminates Japan's ability to manufacture certain critical military equipment. The symbolic message is obvious. America can destroy Japan's industrial capacity one city at a time, using weapons that make conventional bombing obsolete. You're witnessing the birth of nuclear strategy, though the term doesn't exist yet. The bombing of Nagasaki establishes the precedent that atomic weapons can be used not just as experimental curiosities, but as systematic tools of warfare. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership is enormous, as they realize that American atomic capability is not limited to a single experimental weapon, but represents a new category of military power. The rescue efforts in Nagasaki are better organized than those in Hiroshima, but they're still inadequate for the scale of destruction. Military units arrive more quickly, medical supplies are rushed in more efficiently, and there's a better understanding of the need to evacuate people from the most contaminated areas. However, the fundamental challenge remains. Nobody really knows how to deal with atomic destruction, and every response is improvised and experimental. You're among the Hibakusha now, the bomb survivors whose lives have been forever changed by atomic fire. The term doesn't exist yet, but you're beginning to understand that you're part of a new category of human being, someone who has experienced something no one in history had ever survived before. The first steps you take in the days following the bombings are tentative, uncertain, as you try to navigate a world that no longer makes sense according to the rules you've always known. The immediate challenge is simply staying alive. Food and water are scarce, and what's available might be contaminated with radioactive fallout. You're forced to make impossible decisions. Drink from a well that might be poisoned or die of thirst. Eat vegetables grown in contaminated soil or starve. The normal infrastructure that supports human life has been destroyed, and you're dependent on whatever emergency supplies can be brought in from outside the affected areas. Medical care is a nightmare of trial and error. The doctors and nurses who survived the bombings are trying to treat injuries they don't understand with supplies that are rapidly running out. Traditional treatments prove useless against radiation sickness, and Western medicine isn't much better. You watch as medical professionals struggle with symptoms that don't respond to conventional therapy, watching their patients deteriorate despite their best efforts. The frustration and helplessness of the medical community adds another layer of horror to an already impossible situation. The psychological impact of survival is perhaps the most difficult aspect to deal with. You're experiencing what psychologists will later term survivor's guilt, the crushing weight of having lived through something that killed so many others. Why did you survive when your neighbors didn't? What makes you special? The randomness of atomic destruction means that survival often depended on factors completely beyond your control. Being in the right place at the right time, having the right kind of shelter, or simply being lucky enough to be shielded by someone else's body. You're also dealing with the social consequences of being a bomb survivor. Some people avoid contact with you, afraid that whatever mysterious illness is affecting survivors might be contagious. Others refuse to marry into families that were exposed to atomic radiation, fearing that their children might be affected. The stigma associated with radiation exposure creates a social isolation that compounds the physical and psychological trauma of the bombing itself. The immediate priority is finding shelter and reconnecting with family members. The atomic bombings have scattered families across the region, with some members dead, others injured, and still others evacuated to distant locations. The lack of communication makes it nearly impossible to locate missing relatives, and many families will never be reunited. You might spend weeks or months searching for loved ones, only to learn that they were vaporized in the initial blast or died from radiation sickness in some distant refugee camp. Historians still argue whether the long-term effects of radiation exposure were fully understood by the decision-makers who authorized the bombings. But the immediate reality is that you're living through humanity's first large-scale experiment with atomic radiation. The symptoms you're experiencing, hair loss, bleeding gums, mysterious bruises, chronic fatigue, are being documented by doctors and scientists who are trying to understand what atomic weapons do to the human body. Here's something they don't teach you in physics class. The atomic bombs didn't just create physical destruction, they created an entirely new type of human experience. You're essentially beta testing survival in the nuclear age, and there's no instruction manual. It's like being handed a smartphone in 1945 and being told to figure out how to use apps that haven't been invented yet. Except instead of apps, it's radiation poisoning. And instead of a smartphone, it's your body slowly betraying you in ways medical science doesn't understand. The international response to the bombings is beginning to reach you, though slowly and incompletely. Foreign journalists are arriving to document the destruction, and their reports are creating worldwide awareness of what atomic weapons can do. However, the Japanese government is trying to limit access to the affected areas, partly for security reasons, and partly to minimize the propaganda value of the destruction for Japan's enemies. You're also beginning to understand the political implications of what you've experienced. The atomic bombings have forced Japan to surrender, ending World War II, but beginning a new era of international relations dominated by nuclear weapons. The United States has demonstrated that it possesses weapons of unprecedented power, and other nations are already beginning to develop their own atomic capabilities. You're living through the birth of the nuclear age, and the world will never be the same. The reconstruction efforts are beginning, but they're complicated by the radiation contamination that makes some areas dangerous to enter. Buildings can be rebuilt, but the radioactive isotopes scattered throughout the cities will remain hazardous for decades. The economic impact of the bombings extends far beyond the immediate destruction, as the city's industrial capacity has been eliminated and their workforces decimated. Daily life becomes a series of small victories and large challenges. Finding a clean shirt, locating a functioning toilet, getting access to hot food, these basic necessities become precious commodities in the aftermath of atomic destruction. You're learning to live in a world where everything familiar has been destroyed or transformed, where the normal social and economic structures that support human life have collapsed. The medical establishment is completely out of its depth, and you're watching them flail around like they're trying to perform surgery with chopsticks in a dark room. The symptoms you and other survivors are experiencing don't match anything in their textbooks. Hair falling out in clumps, purple spots appearing on skin, bleeding from places that shouldn't bleed. It's like your body is following a completely different set of biological rules. Dr. Takashi Nagai, himself a survivor and radiation victim, becomes one of the first physicians to document what he calls atomic bomb disease. He's simultaneously treating patients and becoming one himself, his own white blood cell count dropping as he works tirelessly to understand what's happening to the human body under radiation exposure. It's medical research conducted under the most horrific circumstances imaginable, where the researcher is also the subject of the experiment. The traditional Japanese medical approach emphasizes harmony and balance in the body, but atomic radiation has thrown all concepts of balance out the window. You're witnessing doctors try everything from herbal remedies to blood transfusions, most of which prove utterly useless against radiation sickness. The Western medical techniques aren't much better blood counts, temperature monitoring, and symptom documentation feel inadequate when facing an entirely new form of human suffering. What's particularly cruel is that many survivors initially felt fine. You might have walked away from the bombing with minor burns and cuts, thinking you'd escaped the worst of it. Then, days or weeks later, your hair starts falling out, your gums begin bleeding, and you develop a bone-deep fatigue that no amount of rest can cure. It's like the bomb is still killing you in slow motion, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop it. The blood-forming organs, bone marrow, lymph nodes, spleen, are particularly vulnerable to radiation damage. You're essentially watching your body's immune system shut down piece by piece. White blood cell counts plummet, making survivors vulnerable to infections that would normally be minor inconveniences. A simple cut can become life-threatening when your body can't produce enough cells to fight off bacteria. Historians still argue whether American military doctors knew what they were looking for when they began studying survivors. But the immediate reality is that you're becoming part of a vast medical study, whether you want to or not. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, later renamed the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, will follow Hibakusha for decades, documenting everything from cancer rates to genetic effects in their children. Here's something that would be funny if it weren't so tragic. Some of the early medical theories about radiation sickness were absolutely bonkers. One doctor suggested that survivors should drink large quantities of beer to flush out the radiation. Another recommended daily doses of liver extract and vitamin B12, as if atomic radiation were just an extreme case of anemia. It's like trying to treat a computer virus with aspirin and bed rest. The psychological symptoms are proving just as baffling as the physical ones. You're experiencing what doctors will later recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. But in 1945, the concept doesn't exist. Shell shock is recognized in soldiers, but there's no framework for understanding the mental health effects of surviving atomic weapons. Depression, anxiety, nightmares, and flashbacks are dismissed as normal reactions to trauma, with no recognition that they might require specific treatment. The medical community is also struggling with the logistics of treating thousands of severely injured people with limited resources. Hospitals that survived the bombings are overwhelmed. Medical supplies are nearly non-existent, and many trained medical personnel are dead or injured. You're watching doctors and nurses work around the clock with whatever materials they can scavenge, performing triage on a scale that had never been imagined. The lack of understanding about radiation exposure creates some genuinely dangerous situations. Medical personnel initially don't realize that contaminated materials and areas pose ongoing risks. Doctors and nurses are exposing themselves to radiation while treating patients, not understanding that the invisible danger extends far beyond the initial blast. It's like performing surgery in a minefield while blindfolded. What makes the medical mystery even more complex is that radiation affects different people in different ways. Age, overall health, distance from the hypocenter, and even genetic factors influence how severely someone is affected. You're part of an unwilling experiment in human radiation tolerance, and the results are being documented in real time by doctors who are learning as they go. The makeshift medical facilities that spring up in the aftermath are studies in improvisation and desperation. School buildings become hospitals, teachers become nurses, and anyone with any medical training finds themselves treating conditions they've never seen before. It's medical care by committee, with everyone learning from everyone else's mistakes, because there are no experts in atomic bomb medicine. August 15th, 1945. The voice crackling through damaged radio speakers across Japan is thin, formal, and speaking in a classical court Japanese that most people can barely understand. But you don't need to parse every word of Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement to grasp its meaning. The war is over, and the atomic bombs, those terrible weapons that turned your cities into nuclear wasteland, have accomplished what years of conventional bombing couldn't. They've broken Japan's will to continue fighting. The irony isn't lost on you that the emperor, who was considered divine and infallible, is now admitting defeat through radio waves that can barely penetrate the electromagnetic chaos left by atomic explosions. His voice, usually ceremonial and distant, now carries the weight of national surrender. He speaks of enduring the unendurable and suffering what is unsufferable. And you're thinking, yeah, we've been doing that for days now. Thanks for the update. What's particularly surreal is listening to this announcement while sitting in the rubble of what used to be your neighborhood. The emperor is talking about preserving the national polity and maintaining Japan's unique cultural identity. But you're surrounded by shadows, burned into concrete and buildings that look like they've been chewed up by a giant monster. The disconnect between the formal language of surrender and the apocalyptic reality of your daily life is almost comical. The emperor's speech never actually uses the word surrender. Instead, he employs the euphemism, terminating the war, as if the conflict had simply reached its natural conclusion, rather than being ended by the most powerful weapons ever created. It's like calling a tornado aggressive weather patterns, or referring to a car crash as automotive discontinuity. The Japanese language's capacity for polite indirectness is being stretched to its absolute limits. You're also realizing that the atomic bombings have fundamentally altered the nature of warfare itself. The emperor specifically mentions that the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, and you're part of the first generation of humans to live in a world where individual weapons can destroy entire cities. The strategic implications are staggering. Traditional military thinking has become obsolete overnight. Historians still argue whether the atomic bombings were necessary to force Japan's surrender, but the immediate reality is that you're living through the end of the most destructive war in human history. The emperor's announcement is being heard by survivors who have witnessed the birth of the nuclear age, and the world is about to enter a new era of international relations dominated by the threat of atomic weapons. The crowd's reaction around you is a mixture of relief, shock, and deep uncertainty. The war is over, but what comes next? American occupation seems inevitable, and you're not sure what that means for a country that has been devastated by the weapons its new occupiers created. It's like being rescued by the same people who just burned down your house. Here's something that would be darkly amusing if it weren't so tragic. Some Japanese officials had been preparing for a final, desperate defense of the home islands, planning to arm civilians with bamboo spears and train them to fight American soldiers to the death. The atomic bombs made this quixotic resistance strategy obviously pointless. You can't fight uranium-235 with pointed sticks and patriotic fervor. The technical aspects of the Emperor's radio announcement are themselves a minor miracle. The Japanese broadcasting system has been severely damaged by months of conventional bombing, and the electromagnetic pulse effects from the atomic weapons have disrupted radio communications across the affected areas. The fact that most people can hear the surrender announcement at all is a testament to the resilience of the broadcast infrastructure. What's particularly poignant is that many families will never hear this announcement together. The atomic bombings have scattered families across Japan, with some members dead, others in hospitals, and still others evacuated to distant locations. The Emperor's voice is reaching people who are still searching for their loved ones, still trying to piece together the fragments of their former lives. The timing of the surrender announcement, coming just days after the Nagasaki bombing, makes it clear that the atomic weapons were decisive in Japan's decision to capitulate. The Emperor's reference to the new and most cruel bomb suggests that Japanese leadership understood they were facing a weapon that made continued resistance impossible. You're living through the first time in history that nuclear weapons have ended a war. The language barrier adds another layer of complexity to the moment. The Emperor's formal, archaic Japanese is difficult even for native speakers to follow, and many people are gathering around radios in groups, trying to collectively decode the meaning of the announcement. It's like receiving the most important news of your life in a foreign language, even though it's technically your own. Shadows are permanent now, burned into concrete and stone by the intense thermal radiation of the atomic blast. These human silhouettes have become the most haunting monuments to nuclear warfare ever created. You walk among them in the days and weeks following the bombing, and they serve as constant reminders of the people who were simply gone, vaporized so quickly that their bodies left shadows on the surfaces behind them, like some cosmic photography project using human beings as subjects. The most famous shadow is on the steps of the Hiroshima bank, where someone was sitting when the bomb detonated. The stone steps are bleached white by the thermal radiation, except for the human-shaped darker area where a person's body absorbed the heat. It's a reverse silhouette, a negative image of someone's final moment. You find yourself staring at it, trying to imagine who that person was, what they were thinking about in their last seconds of life. These shadows aren't just on buildings, they're on bridges, sidewalks, walls, anywhere that the thermal pulse from the atomic explosion created enough heat to permanently alter the surface. Some show people in mid-stride, others capture people sitting or lying down. It's like someone took a photograph of the entire city at the moment of detonation, using physics instead of film to capture the image. The scientific explanation for these shadows is actually straightforward. The intense thermal radiation from the atomic blast, temperatures reaching several thousand degrees Fahrenheit, bleached or burned the exposed surfaces, while human bodies absorbed enough of the heat to shield the areas behind them. It's basic physics, but the result is profoundly disturbing. People reduced to shadows on stone, their physical existence erased, but their final moments preserved forever. What makes these shadows particularly eerie is their mundane nature. These aren't dramatic poses or heroic stances. They're just people going about their daily lives. Someone walking to work, someone sitting on steps, someone pushing a cart. The atomic bomb didn't discriminate between the heroic and the ordinary. It simply vaporized everyone within a certain radius, leaving behind these quiet monuments to interrupted lives. You're also noticing that the shadows tell a story about the bomb's power that no amount of technical description could convey. The fact that human beings were heated to the point of vaporization in microseconds demonstrates an energy release that's almost incomprehensible. These shadows are proof that nuclear weapons operate on a scale that transcends normal human experience. Historians still argue whether these shadows will fade over time or remain as permanent reminders of the atomic age. But the immediate reality is that they're serving as unofficial memorials to the bombing victims. People are leaving flowers near some of the shadows, creating spontaneous shrines to unknown individuals whose final moments have been preserved in stone. The children among the survivors are particularly fascinated and disturbed by the shadows. They ask questions that adults can't answer. Where did the person go? Are they still there? Can shadows hurt you? It's impossible to explain the physics of thermal radiation to a child, and even harder to explain why human beings would create weapons capable of turning people into shadows. Here's something that manages to be both scientifically fascinating and deeply unsettling. The shadows aren't all the same intensity. The strength and clarity of each shadow depends on the person's distance from the hypocenter, their body position, and the surface they were against. It's like the bomb was an artist, creating a gallery of human silhouettes with varying degrees of detail and permanence. The preservation of these shadows is creating an ethical dilemma for the reconstruction efforts. Some people want to preserve them as monuments to the bombing victims, while others find them too disturbing and want them removed. It's a question that will persist for decades. How do you honor the memory of people who were literally reduced to shadows on stone? As you walk through the devastated city, the shadows seem to follow you. They're everywhere on buildings, bridges, sidewalks, a constant reminder that you're walking through what is essentially a vast cemetery. The atomic bomb didn't just kill people, it created a new type of monument to human mortality, where the victims themselves became their own memorials. The technical term for these shadows is thermal shadows or atomic shadows, and they're being studied by scientists trying to understand the physics of nuclear weapons. But for you, living among them, there's something far more personal. They're the final evidence of lives interrupted, stories ended mid-sentence, people who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when humanity unleashed the power of the atom. The shadows are also serving as a kind of atomic clock, marking the precise moment when the nuclear age began. They're frozen at 8:15 a.m. in Hiroshima and 11:02 a.m. in Nagasaki, permanent reminders of the moments when everything changed. You're living in the aftermath of those moments, and the shadows are your constant companions in this new world. As the days pass, and the immediate crisis of survival gives way to the long process of recovery, the shadows remain. They'll be there when the cities are rebuilt, when the radiation levels drop, when the hibakusha grow old, and their stories become history. The shadows on stone are permanent witnesses to the atomic age, and they'll outlast everyone who saw the bombs fall. Walking among these shadows in the quiet hours before dawn, you feel a strange sense of peace. The city is beginning to sleep again, the immediate panic of survival giving way to a deeper understanding of what has happened. The shadows are no longer just reminders of death. They're also testament to the human capacity to witness, to remember, and to continue living in the face of the unthinkable. The atomic age has begun, and these shadows are its first monuments. They'll remain long after the rubble is cleared and the buildings are rebuilt, quiet reminders of the day when humanity learned that it could destroy itself with the power of the sun. And in their permanence, there's a kind of comfort, a promise that these moments, these people, these stories will not be forgotten. The shadows fade into the growing darkness of evening, but they'll be there tomorrow and the day after, and for years to come. They're part of the landscape now, part of the story of these cities and their people. And as you finally allow yourself to rest, surrounded by the quiet presence of these atomic monuments, you understand that you've witnessed something that will change the world forever, and that the shadows on stone will be there to remind future generations of the price of that change.